After the disaster of the runaway mail coach, Lord Spittleworth took steps to make sure such a thing would never happen again. A new proclamation was issued, without the king's knowledge, which allowed the chief adviser to open letters to check them for signs of treason. The proclamation notices helpfully listed all the things that were now considered treason in Cornucopia. It was still treason to say that the Ichabod wasn't real, and that Fred wasn't a good king. It was treason to criticise Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon. Treason to say the Ichabod tax was too high, and, for the first time, treason to say that Cornucopia wasn't as happy and well-fed as it had always been. Now that everybody was too frightened to tell the truth in their letters, mail and even travel to the capital dwindled to almost nothing, which was exactly what Spittleworth had wanted. He started on phase 2 of his plan. This was to send a lot of fan mail to Fred. As those letters couldn't all have the same handwriting, Spittleworth had shut up a few soldiers in a room with a stack of paper and quills and told them what to write. "Praise the king, of course," said Spittleworth. "Tell him that he's the best ruler the country has ever had. Praise me, too. Say you don't know what would have happened to Cornucopia without me. And say that you know that the Ichabod would have killed many more people if not for the Ichabod Defence Brigade. And say that Cornucopia is richer than ever." So Fred began to receive letters telling him how marvellous he was, and that the country had never been happier, and that the war against the Ichabod was going very well indeed. "It appears everything is going splendidly," beamed King Fred, waving one of those letters over lunch with the two lords. "I had no idea so many Ichabods had been killed. In fact, come to think of it, I didn't even know there was more than one Ichabod." "Yes, sire," said Spittleworth, with a furious glance at Flapoon, who was stuffing himself with some delicious cream cheese. He'd given Flapoon the job of checking all the forged letters before they were sent to the king. "We didn't wish to alarm you, but we realised some time ago that the monster had reproduced." "I see," said Fred. "Well, it's jolly good news you're finishing them off at such a rate. We should have one stuffed, you know, and hold an exhibition for people." "Yes, sire, what an excellent idea," said Spittleworth through gritted teeth. "One thing I don't understand, though," said Fred. "Didn't Professor Fraudisham say that every time an Ichabod dies, 2 grows in its place? By killing them like this, aren't you in fact doubling their numbers?" "No, sire, not really," said Spittleworth, his mind working furiously fast. "We've found a way to stop that happening by, banging them over the head first," suggested Flapoon. Yes, that's it. If you can get near enough to knock them out before killing them, sir, the doubling process seems to stop." "Well, why didn't you tell me this amazing discovery, Spittleworth?" "This changes everything," cried Fred. "We might soon have wiped Ichabods from Cornucopia forever." "Yes, it is good news, isn't it?" said Spittleworth. "However, there are still quite a few Ichabods left." "But it does seem that the end is in sight," said Fred joyfully. "How very sad that poor Major Roach was killed by an Ichabod just before we began to turn the tables on the monsters." "Yes, very sad, sire," agreed Spittleworth, who had explained away Major Roach's sudden disappearance by telling the king he'd lain down his life in the marshlands trying to prevent the Ichabods travelling south. "Well, the servants are constantly singing the national anthem. Have you heard them?" said Fred. "Jolly uplifting and all that, but it does become a bit samey. But this is why. They're celebrating our triumph over the Ichabods, aren't they?" "That must be it, sire," said Spittleworth. In fact, the singing was coming from the prisoners in the dungeons, not the servants, but Fred was unaware that he had 50 or so people trapped in the dungeons beneath him. "We should hold a ball in celebration," said Fred. "It seems an age since I danced with Lady Eslander." "Nuns don't dance," said Spittleworth crossly. "Flapoon, a word." The two lords were halfway towards the door when the king commanded them to wait. Fred suddenly looked displeased. "Neither of you asked permission to leave the king's table." "I crave your majesty's pardon," said Spittleworth. "It's simply that if we are to act on your excellent suggestion of having a dead Ichabod stuffed, sire, we must act quickly. It might, rot otherwise." "All the same," said Fred, "I remain the king, Spittleworth. Your king." "Of course, sire," said Spittleworth. "I live only to serve you." "Well, see that you remember it, and be quick about stuffing that Ichabod. I wish to display it to the people. Then we shall discuss the celebration ball." As soon as Spittleworth and Flapoon were out of earshot of the king, Spittleworth rounded on his other lordship. "You were supposed to check all those letters before giving them to the king. Where am I supposed to find a dead Ichabod to stuff?" "Sow something?" suggested Flapoon. "Sow something? Well, what else can you do?" "What can I do?" repeated Spittleworth. "You think this is my problem?" "You were the one who invented the Ichabod," said Flapoon. He was getting very bored of Spittleworth shouting at him and bossing him about. "And you're the one who killed Beamish. Where would you be now if I hadn't blamed the monster?" Spittleworth turned and headed down to the dungeons. At the very least, he could stop the prisoners singing the national anthem so loudly, so the king might think the war against the Ichabods had taken a turn for the worse again. "Quiet!" bellowed Spittleworth as he entered the dungeon, because the place was ringing with noise. There was singing and laughing, and Cankaby the footman was running between the cells, fetching and carrying kitchen equipment for all the different prisoners. The smell of the maiden's dreams, fresh from Mrs. Beamish's ovens, filled the warm air. The prisoners looked far better fed than the last time Spittleworth had been down here. He didn't like this at all. "You are keeping track, aren't you," he said to Cankaby, "of all these pots and knives and what-nots you're handing out?" "Of course, my lord," gasped the footman, not liking to admit that he was actually confused by all the orders Mrs. Beamish was giving him, and he had no idea which prisoner had what. Sometimes Cankaby worried that the warder of the dungeon, who was fond of wine, might not hear the prisoners whispering to each other if they took it into their heads to plot anything after the candles were snuffed out at night. However, Cankaby could tell that Spittleworth was in no mood to have problems brought to him, and so the footman held his tongue. "There will be no more singing," shouted Spittleworth. "The king has a headache." In fact, it was Spittleworth's head who was beginning to throb. He forgot the prisoners as soon as he turned his back on them, and fell back to pondering how on earth he was going to make a convincing stuffed Ichabod. Perhaps Flapoon was on to something. Might they take the skeleton of a bull and kidnap a seamstress to stitch a dragonish covering over the bones and pad it out with sawdust? Lies upon lies upon lies. Once you started lying, you had to continue, and then it was like being captain of a leaky ship, always plugging holes in the side to stop yourself from sinking. Lost in thoughts of skeletons and sawdust, Spittleworth had no idea that he'd just turned his back on what promised to be his biggest problem yet, a dungeon full of plotting prisoners, each of whom had knives and chisels hidden beneath their blankets and behind loose bricks in their walls.